After giving the genealogy of Noah, we find these words in Genesis chapter 11. Now the whole earth had one language and the same words, and the people migrated from the east and found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. And they said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly." And they had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. And then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its tops in the heavens. And let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth." And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the children of man had built. And the Lord said, "Behold, they are one people, and they have all one language, and this is the beginning of what they will do, and nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language, so that they may not understand one another's speech." You may be seated.
Well, thanks, Charles, for that reading. We're concluding a two-part series that we introduced last Sunday night on the cities we build is the theme. Introduced it last Sunday, the idea of postmodern. What's the postmodern worldview? And the postmodern worldview is not necessarily the idea that all truths are equally valid. It's more the premise of we construct our worlds. We decide on how to construct, or at least how to perceive, reality by our past, our present, our family of origin, the way we think of people, the way we think of ourselves. Just we decide and construct the way we see things. To a degree, that makes sense. Have you ever been in maybe a little spat or conflict, and people see it differently? You ever had your kids, they're in an argument, they run to tell you what happened, and they both tell a very different perspective? We see things in tainted ways, right? The filters we use, we don't always perceive reality as reality. We pick and choose, we construct, we assess, we determine, and so then we come out with perceptions. Now, that's partly accurate, but also problematic, right? We do indeed construct our worlds, but look at the mess we're constructing. Look at our own country, look at our own families, look at our own past. Look at the nations around us. Just look at the history of humanity. What a mess. And it starts early, right? We talked about and spent most of our time last Sunday on the city that Cain builds. Right? We have Adam and Eve, and God empowers them to reflect His presence, to mold reality as God did, right? God starts there in Genesis with chaos, and the presence of God molds that into a garden of delight. It molds that into life and beauty and purpose. And we were empowered to have that ability. But then we see how in Genesis chapter 3 it says there that the essence of what the serpent is offering is that humanity could be like God, knowing good and evil. Let me paraphrase that to what I think it's saying, especially to our topic today. The idea of we could be like God, determining right and wrong, deciding what is good and evil. Which sounds attractive. Don't we want to be in charge? Hashtag it's my life, I can do whatever I want kind of mindset. Nobody can tell me what I do, Well, There's an attraction to that. But there's also a huge problem with that. By what standards do we construct our worlds? There's always an us and a them, my people, and then against everybody else. We always seem to elevate ourselves and demean others. What I introduced last time and want to reemphasize tonight is I think the topics we're addressing in these two sermons are foundational. In the sense of what? It helps us understand the big picture. It helps us understand what God intended us to be, why we're in the mess we're at, and then why do we keep getting into the same problems we get in, and then thus what's the solution? And so yes, God created us to then create. Right? We were to then go, multiply, subdue the earth. We were to spread out that worldview of God. But instead, once again, there in Genesis 3, we decide to take for ourselves the ability to define what's right and wrong. And then the very next story is Cain kills his brother, and then he goes and builds a city. And it's a city that's setting the stage for, like, how does that social experiment go? Well, it leads to the flood. That's how it goes. It leads to chaos and pain and suffering and violence and destruction. The world is contaminated with the worldview of you just decide to do whatever you want. And as sophisticated as that sounds today, it is the essence of what humanity has been struggling with since Genesis 3 forward. We define what's right and wrong. And inevitably, my definition conflicts with your definition, and then we're going to fight for resources. We're going to power play each other. I'm going to gather some people. You're going to gather some people. This is my land. No, this is your land. And it just goes from there. And then we have a battle of goods. Everybody, every people group, every war, both sides are always under the impression they're doing what's right. Right? And we have that conflict. Well, on the other side of the flood, you're like, there we go. We're going to start again. The earth has been cleaned. We're going to start again with a family who believes in God, who trusts God, who's going to kind of like a new Adam and Eve, like it's going to be a good thing. And then there's this weird story of how it involves nakedness and shame and Noah and one of his sons, Ham. And it's a fascinating rabbit hole of what all that means, except to say what's clear about it, that it is a negative thing, that it reflects language of Adam and Eve, where they saw and took, and then there was shame, and there was nakedness, and then there's pain and suffering. And that's a similar event, and you're like, the reader's left to scratch their heads and be like, here we go again. Here we go again. And then the next story, which are about 101 years later, if we're kind of, oh, sorry. Everybody awake? We good? Okay. If we're counting the chronology there, we're about 100 years later, and then we have the story of the Tower of Babel. And as Charles read, here's another attempt of building a city. Folks are gathering. There's this idea of like, you know what? Let's bring humanity together. Let's be of the same language. And I don't think there's just about the idea of they're speaking common language. It is they're of the same words. In other words, they're of the same mindset, the same premise of let's gather together. We're going to put in the middle of this new city, we're going to put a tower to the heavens, and we're going to make a name for ourselves, which is a parallel story of God creating Adam and Eve, and God creating a humanity, gathering a humanity, creating a garden. In the middle of a garden, there's a portal, right? The tree of life that connects with God. But here's humanity trying to do that. And the tower, in English, it's translated tower, which loses a little. The word for that's translated tower is a religious building. It's like they're building a church, a tabernacle, a religious structure. And then you're like, to worship what? Or to worship what God? Themselves. So they're gathering a humanity, they're building a city, and the center of the city stands the symbol of what that city is about, is to put humanity in the heavens. What does that mean? In the ancient world, the gods were in the heavens. Right? Just think of like the Greeks, Mount Olympus. Like high places was how you got closer to the gods. Most of the tabernacles of the religious buildings, the altars, the sacrifice, they were all in high places. And the concept was there, you're getting close to the God. So here's a religious structure that is high, and it's higher than most because of new technology, the brick. And it is the way humanity is gathering to that concept of like, we can take our place in the heavens. And we could be like gods. Genesis 3. And that's going to attract people. Because why? Because people want to be their own gods. They want to be in charge. They want to decide what's right and wrong. Well, instead of getting up to the heavens, they get God to come down to them, and God is not pleased with it. And the reason God's not pleased is not about tall buildings. We've built taller buildings since. It's about the concept of what it stands for. A humanity that is trying to be like God. A humanity that's creating a city, a world view, that's creating a reality that they're in charge of deciding what's right and wrong. And as exciting and as fascinating as modern a concept that is inevitably a path of pain and suffering, death and destruction. And this is a satire of one of the big players of the time was the Babylonians. And they had their creation story, and their creation story was one of gods and big violence, and we've talked about that in previous sermons. And this is making a satire of that story. Yes, indeed, you brought a humanity together. Yes, indeed, you made a name for yourselves. Yes, indeed, you're powerful. But you are creating a city of violence, where the Babylonians were brutal and cruel. And if you back up one chapter, in Genesis chapter 10, you got this chapter about the nations, and it is the descendants of Ham, right? The one son of Noah that had some shady things going on there. It's his descendant leads to this one guy called Nimrod, and he is the founder of Babylon. And the idea of Nimrod, the name means mighty warrior, slayer of men and beasts. You're thinking, yeah, that's a great nation to have, build on a warrior. Yeah, but it's a warrior that is coming from a very shady situation. It's almost like here's Cain again. And so God comes down, and it says 3 different times that we're going to build the city for ourselves. God comes to see the city they're building, and then God is going to stop that project. Why is God stopping that? Because if God allows humanity to unbridled, to have without any stoppage, with any just walls keeping them bound, with any boundaries, they will create a humanity of violence. Haven't we seen that in history? And this isn't just like thousands of years ago because everybody was, they're just backwards, and they're just these idiots, and they just ran around, making weird sounds and hitting people with a stick. Humanity's been doing horrible things since ever. Or not since ever, since Genesis 3. And continues to. Horrible, horrible things. Because they get to decide what's right and wrong. So this becomes a satire, right? So at the end there of chapter verse 8 and 9, you have, so God scattered them, stopped building the city, and God confused their language, and that's why it's called Babel. I mean, you can hear it in English. Babylon, Babel, babbling. It's that play of words, and so it's making fun or poking. It's a satire of what Babylon claimed to be and what it became. And Babylon becomes the example of what it looks like for humanity to build a city that leads to violence. Later, much later in the story, Babylon's going to destroy Jerusalem. Much later in the story, Jesus is going to claim that Jerusalem has become the new Babylon. And then you get even to what's the end of our book, our Bible, right? Revelations. It's talking about the city of Babylon. And it's making a reference to Rome. And like it becomes a standard by which it's a category that illustrates what happens to humanity that builds a city where they decide what's right and wrong. And it's a pattern that repeats. And it just repeats. So how does God work through that mess? Well, God is going to build his own city. God's going to build his own humanity, his own nation. And we get to that in Exodus chapter 19, verse 5 through 8. So now, here's Moses speaking to the people that have been freed from a Babylon-like experience, right? But in this case, Egypt. So now if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all the nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the entire earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests, a holy nation. These are the words you are to speak to the Israelites. So then Moses is going to summon them, is going to offer them this covenant, this new relationship, partnership with God. And they're like, yay, we're on board. And you're like, wow, here we go, a new humanity. We're going to do Genesis 1 and 2 again. God just pulled them out of chaos, this time the chaos of Egypt, a new Babylon-like experience, right? And God is going to mold that or deconstruct that chaos into a promised land, new people, new reality, new world. The story of Genesis, which I keep going back to, is repetitive through the entire storyline of the Bible. It's a pattern that keeps reappearing in the different stories. And it uses certain language and links to connect the reader to it. And so here we have that God's going to do Genesis again. Genesis 1 through, we're going to fix the mess. And because of that, this people group is going to be different than what's offered out there. There's other ways of being humanity. There's other worldviews, and they're guided by their gods, and those people deciding what they think is right and wrong. We're going to be holy, which literally means set apart. And we're going to show the world what does it look like to be a humanity that lives by the standard that God decides. Wouldn't that be something? What does that look like? Well, it doesn't take long for it to not go well. By the time we get to Jeremiah, where Babylon comes back to the story and is going to destroy Jerusalem, we have this accusation or these words, God through Jeremiah to Jerusalem. Then Jeremiah said, this is Jeremiah chapter 26, verse 12 to 15. Then Jeremiah said to all the officials, all the people, the Lord sent me to prophesy against this house and this city. Right? So here we have Jerusalem, that is supposed to be a city representing the people of God, are now they're making a mess. Here's all the things you have done. All the things because you did not hear what I said. So now reform your ways and your actions and obey the Lord your God. Then the Lord will relent and not bring the disaster he has pronounced again. There's still time. We have to stop deciding what we think is best, what we think is right and wrong. And Jerusalem got themselves in that mess. As for me, because the leaders of Jerusalem were so annoyed at the words of Jeremiah, because nobody likes to hear, hey, here's the problem in your life, the choices you're making. Nobody likes that. We rather blame everybody else. And so Jeremiah here is getting blamed. He's like the naysayer. And they were so annoyed at him, they're thinking of killing him. As for me, I'm in your hands. Verse 14. Do to me whatever you think is good and right. Right? You decide what's good and right. But here's the catch. But be assured, however, that if you put me to death, you will bring the guilt of innocent blood. Where have we heard that before? Buddy, story of Cain. The blood of innocent Abel cries out to the Lord. I think the reader here is supposed to be like, oh man, these religious leaders are like Cain. They're thinking of shedding innocent blood because they decide what's right and wrong. But if you do this, this city, it will fall on this city and all who live in it. For in truth, the Lord has sent me to speak to all these words to you. In other words, you want to kill me? You want to shed innocent blood? You should go back and read the story of Cain. How'd that turn out? And that's what's going to come on you. There's going to be a new flood, but now on Jerusalem. And it's not going to be through water. It's going to be through a nation. Babylon is going to flood upon Jerusalem. Well, how about we skip a few hundred years and go to Jesus? In Matthew chapter 23, here we're at the last week of Jesus in Jerusalem before his crucifixion. Last week, last few days. And in Matthew chapter 22 and 23, Jesus is going to have these woes, 7 woes against 7 warnings against Israel, against Jerusalem, against the leaders. And then we get to chapter 23, he says this to the religious leaders. You snakes, you broods of viper, how will you escape being condemned to hell? Therefore, I'm sending you prophets and sages and teachers. Some of them you will kill and crucify. Others you will flog in your synagogues and pursue from town to town. And so upon you will come all the righteous blood that has been shed on earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. The entire storyline that started with Cain shedding innocent blood is going to culminate on the destruction of Jerusalem because you, the new people of God, have become as bad as Cain. You have been as bad as Babylon. It's coming on you because they were willing to shed the ultimate innocent blood of Jesus. How far must you get as a humanity that claims to be a people of God, yet you killed the very God who came? Right? And then continuing verse 36 of Matthew 23, truly I tell you, all this will come on this generation. He's talking about the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans. And then Jesus says, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who killed the prophets and you stoned those who who are sent to you, how often have I longed to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and you were not willing. He's saying, I am God who's tried to bring you back, to pull you out of the mess, to save you from the chaos. Just read Genesis forward. God continuously has tried to bring humanity out of the mess. But look, your house is left to you desolate. For I tell you, you will not see me again until you say, blessed is who comes in the name of the Lord. He's saying it will be left, it's just going to be destroyed. The imagery of all these destructions, including the flood, it's just a reoccurring image that keeps coming on humanity. So what are we left with? Destruction, pain, suffering. We just change the names, change we just give new names to different people groups, and then we go and hate each other and kill each other and new wars, and then we just go from there. is that the inevitable path we continue on? Well, Jesus comes, so that's already different. And Jesus is going to continue a building project, but doing things a little different. Jesus claims to be a new Genesis. If you read Matthew, in Matthew chapter 1, genealogy of Jesus, verse 1, and then where it says the birth of Jesus, verse 17, I've made this point before. In Greek, the word there is Genesis. Matthew wants the reader to know that Jesus is the new beginning, which isn't like we just had that in Genesis 1 and 2. Now we have that in Jesus. There's a bunch of new Genesis moments, new Garden of Eden imagery and moments that God continues to try leading up to Jesus, Israel being one of them. And then it culminates with this idea in Matthew chapter 1, verse 22 and 23. All this took place to fulfill what the Lord had said through the prophets. In other words, the birth narrative of Jesus. The virgin will be conceived and will give birth to a son, and they will call him God with us, Emmanuel. The promise in Genesis 3:15 was to Eve that one of your descendants, you will give birth to a person, a human, that will crush evil, that will crush the descendants of the snake. What did Jesus call the religious leaders, if not brood of vipers? You religious leaders, you're the descendants of the snake in Genesis 3. And I am the one promised in Genesis 3:15, a descendant of a woman who's going to crush the descendants of evil. And that's all to be fulfilled in Jesus as being God's presence with us. In John chapter 1, verse 14, Jesus is the new structure, the new tabernacle, the new Tower of Babel equivalent. And that's described in John chapter 1, verse 14. It says, the Word, talking about Jesus, became flesh and made his dwelling among us. The translation, dwelling among us, the best translation there is pitched his tent. So here's God who pitches his tent with humanity. Like, where have we had this tent imagery if not the tabernacle? A tent that represented that the God of the heavens, Yahweh, would go with his people. They just take them with them. And Jesus is like, it's the God who came and pitched his tent again. But in a very different, powerful, uniquely notable way that came to show us the glory of the one and only time that God pitches his tent this particular way. As a human, not as a structure, not as humanity's version of it in the Tower of Babel, but God in Jesus is the connecting point between two worlds. He is the religious structure. He is the way you can come to God and have access to the heavens. It's Jesus. So all that the tabernacle was for, all that the Tower of Babel was trying to be, all that the temple was with Solomon, it is Jesus. You don't have to create another way to get to the heavens. You don't have to create another way to find true fulfillment. You don't have to create another way to be God-like. You don't have to find another way to access the divine. It's Jesus. In Matthew chapter 5, and here's where it's really cool. And this is a Genesis imagery here. In Genesis, God is the cosmic ruler, right? He is God. And then he creates this reality, this physical reality, and it starts chaotic. He pushes chaos out, landscapes it into beauty and harmony and love and peace and joy and the garden. He puts representatives of him in this physical reality, that's us, Adam and Eve, to co-rule with him, to partner with God. Why? I'm just going to have to ask God one of these days. But here, God in Jesus does that again. Listen. He says to the people here, this is the beginning of the kind of the Sermon on the Mount, first few here in chapter 5 of Matthew. So if you read the end of chapter 4, who's listening are the peasants, the nobodies of that world, the people without political power, without military might, without money, without influence, without followers, without hashtags, without the nobodies. And he says to them, you are the light of the world. A city built on a hill cannot be hidden. Come on. You're the new city. I came so that you can be the new humanity. You can be the light that God intended. You can be the new city. And not just a city that's out of chaos and pain and suffering and death and violence, and not even a political structure like Israel. You, the peasants, the bottom of humanity, you're going to shine as if you were on the hill. Why a hill? Because that's how you got close to the gods, right? On the high places. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. In other words, what you are going to be able to do because of me being God with you cannot be hidden. It will be put on a stand. It will give light to everyone. In the same way, let your light shine before others so that they may see your good deeds and glorify God who's in the heavens. Here's how you do the Tower of Babel right. You build a city. Actually, God builds a city. With the temple, actually, just with humans. Who's the temple in the middle? Jesus. Who's the actual tower, right? Jesus. He's the connecting point to the heavens. He's God who came. And then the city around us isn't gathering because of a new technology, isn't gathering to put their names in the heavens, because we are the representation of God. We are to be the image of God. We, the people, are the city. Not the structures, not the political mess, not the violence, not the way we live is to be how people will know God. The way we live. And then if you read the rest of the Sermon on the Mount, it's this weird way of living. It's this upside down reality. It's like by being kind and compassionate and loving and merciful and peaceful. And it's just weird. Okay, last time I quoted the song, We Built This City on Rock and Roll. Y'all remember that? I'm going to quote a different song today. The song Imagine by John Lennon. Just listen. He wants you to imagine the kind of world we could have. So just listen. Imagine there's no heaven. It's easy if you try. No hell below us. Above us, only sky. Imagine all the people living just for today. Imagine there's no countries. It isn't hard to do. Nothing to kill or die for. And no religion to. Imagine all the people living in peace. Imagine no possessions. I wonder if you can. No need for greed or hunger. A brotherhood of man. Imagine all the people sharing all the world. Now you may say I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. I hope someday you will join us, and then the world will be as one. Well, that's beautiful. Here's where he goes wrong. He assumes that the problem is religion, politics, countries, possessions, and you could add whatever else you want to the list. Guns, political parties, I don't care what you add to it, social injustice. Here's the problem. Those things are symptoms of the problem. The problem is a humanity who wants to decide for themselves what's right and wrong. That's where we draw boundary lines. That's why we use religion as a means to punish people. That's why some of us have and many do not. That's why we kill and take. The problem isn't the symptoms. Those are just the inevitable consequences. You could get rid of religion. You could get rid of borders. You could get rid of money. It would not fix the problem. We just find other ways to hurt each other. Because the problem inevitably is just that person in the mirror. Man, I could quote Michael Jackson. I could just quote. We could really make a whole sermon here. So what's the solution? We just got to come to Jesus. We got to let God define what's right and wrong, and then you and I just get to reflect that into a broken world. The world says that we need to impose and be rich and powerful and status. And Jesus says you just have to be a person that loves, that is kind, that is compassionate, that is forgiving, that is about peace. And here's the problem with church today. I think too often we're still trying to let the world define for us what the solution should be. We just spin it a little, put some Jesus on it, and we just go with that. Now, we're about to celebrate 50 years. And I think we should be very introspective in the next 50 years. What kind of church are we building? Are we building it? Does it look more like the churches down the street? Or does it look more like what God intended humanity to be? Does it gather around Jesus, or does it gather around anything else? Do we go to God for the solutions even when it's counterintuitive and countercultural? Or do we go to the voices beyond that are promising all kinds of solutions? Do we go to political parties? Do we go to government? Do we go to these folks, those folks, my people, those people? I want us to, just like John Lennon invited, imagine a humanity that gathers around the presence of God and Jesus, that abdicates the tendency to want to be in charge, that instead submits to God, that instead takes deep down inside that image of God that is in us, that is kind and compassion, that it reaches out across the aisles, that loves all people, that cares for people, that is willing to help the needy, that is willing to reflect nothing more than Jesus. I hope someday you will join us. And indeed, the world then could be one. If any of this is resonating with you, why don't you come as we stand and sing?